Mr. Darcy, an insufferable snob. Elizabeth Bennet, a self-righteous woman with a chip on her shoulder. A solid foundation for a long-term relationship, wouldn't you say? Each of them believed they understood the world better than anyone else, and both of them were catastrophically wrong. That is exactly why Pride and Prejudice is not a cozy classic about love. It is a textbook on cognitive biases, written by Jane Austen 200 years before psychologists had names for them. Today we're going to look at why Darcy was actually mortified by Lady Catherine, how he managed to deliver the worst marriage proposal in literary history, and why his transformation is not the magic of love, but a painful and difficult rewiring of a deeply entrenched mindset. Before we get into the characters, 1 minute on the era. Without it, a lot of the decisions people make in this novel look baffling. England, early 19th century. A woman cannot work, cannot own property, cannot inherit an estate. The only way to secure her future is to marry well, not the man she loves. The man who can provide. Romance was a luxury women of that era simply could not afford. Survival was the stakes. The Bennet family lives on an estate that, by law, will pass to a distant male relative upon the father's death. 5 daughters, no sons, no inheritance. Mrs. Bennet, whom everyone treats as a comic figure, is a woman living in a state of chronic existential dread. She may not be the sharpest mind in the novel, but ask yourself honestly, could you spend that many years under that kind of pressure and come out entirely rational? She is the only member of the family who fully grasps what will happen if the daughters don't marry. That is why Charlotte Lucas's decision, Elizabeth's closest friend, to accept the insufferable Mr. Collins is, in its own way, a happy ending. Cold, rational calculation multiplied by desperation. She sees her options clearly and chooses stability. Austen does not judge her for it, and neither should we. Against this backdrop, Elizabeth Bennet is an anomaly. She turns down Collins. She turns down Darcy at his first proposal. She allows herself the luxury of choice and pays for it in anxiety, family pressure, and reputational risk. This matters. Her independence is not free. It costs her a great deal. And now, to the characters themselves, and to what is actually happening inside their heads. Let's take Darcy apart to understand what this particular block of marble is actually made of, starting with his internal wiring. If we apply the Big Five personality model, we get a perfect portrait of a man defined by duty. His conscientiousness is off the charts. He is responsible to his core. But his agreeableness is remarkably low. Darcy is not someone who tries to be liked. His primary drive is to meet his own internal standards. In the 7 Radicals profiling system, this is a classic paranoid type. These are people whose baseline emotion is pride, and whose core need is the achievement of significant goals and the preservation of status. In his world, everything must have a clear purpose and its proper place in the hierarchy. This is why he operates almost entirely on internal reference. He has no need for the approval of the Muriton set. He is his own judge, jury, and sentencing authority. But this monumental self-sufficiency has a dark side: informational isolation. Look at the people around him. There is simply no one capable of giving him honest, uncomfortable feedback. The staff at Pemberley adore him. He is a consistent, fair, and predictable employer. His sister Georgiana sees him as her sole protection. His best friend Bingley is too gentle and too deferential. He has long been in the habit of trusting Darcy's judgment over his own. The result is that Darcy has spent years marinating in his own certainty of being right. He genuinely does not register that what feels to him like natural reserve reads to everyone else as contemptuous arrogance. This is a textbook case of the fundamental attribution error working in reverse. Observers read his silence as superiority, while Darcy himself experiences it simply as maintaining appropriate distance. He is not trying to be unpleasant. He is a hostage to his own default program of avoiding failure, so afraid of dropping his social guard or committing a visible mistake that he would rather come across as a statue than show any vulnerability. The real disaster arrives when Darcy decides to step outside his comfort zone and propose to Elizabeth. In his own mind, this is a grand act of self-sacrifice and moral courage. His internal reference system is running at full power. He has decided on his own that his feelings matter more than the social obstacles, given himself credit for it, and shown up to collect his reward. At this moment, he is completely in the grip of the illusion of transparency. He is utterly convinced that his internal struggle and suffering are obvious to Elizabeth, and that she must be flattered by the journey he has made for her sake. What he actually delivers is a textbook example of what happens when someone in a state of intense emotional pressure loses all capacity for empathy. As Darcy himself later admits, he was not thinking about Elizabeth as a person with her own feelings at all. He was entirely consumed by his own internal conflict. His speech therefore lands not as a declaration of love, but as a list of grievances about her family, rounded off with a condescending, "But I love you in spite of it all." And then comes the thing his entire operating system was not built to handle: a devastating rejection. Elizabeth hits him exactly where it hurts most. She tells him his behavior has been thoroughly ungentlemanlike. For a man whose entire life is constructed around ethics, duty, and propriety, this is not merely an insult. It is a system error. It is the cold shock that, for the first time in 28 years, actually cracks his armor and knocks him off his pedestal. And this, precisely, is what triggers the transformation. Darcy is a man of action and determination, and having received that feedback, he does not retreat into self-pity. He sets about correcting the flaw in the system with characteristic single-mindedness, driven first and foremost by a need to prove to himself that he can be the gentleman he always believed himself to be. Most readers receive Lady Catherine de Bourgh as simply an unpleasant and overbearing aristocrat, but in this story, she performs a crucial psychological function. Despite the vast difference in manners, she and Darcy share one fundamental assumption: neither of them has ever genuinely anticipated being told no. Their reactions to that refusal, however, are entirely different. Lady Catherine responds with fury. In her world, the social hierarchy is absolute, and any resistance reads to her as a personal affront. Darcy, at the moment of his own rejection, is stunned and disoriented. Despite the fact that no one has ever said quite so many cutting things to his face at once, some of which were, admittedly, not entirely fair, he maintains his composure. Unlike his aunt, who charges forward like a freight train, Darcy is capable of experiencing confusion, and that capacity is what leaves him open to change. Watching Lady Catherine hold court at Rosings, Darcy feels a sharp and persistent discomfort. He may not consciously name what he is seeing, but she is his possible future. She is the same paranoid character type, in whom wealth and power have over time entirely displaced any capacity for empathy. Where Darcy interfered in Bingley's private life, genuinely believing he was acting in his friend's interests, Lady Catherine has long since stopped looking for moral justifications. She simply issues commands. The supreme irony is that it is precisely Lady Catherine's overconfidence that ultimately helps Darcy. Her visit to Elizabeth is the peak of absurdity, so consumed by rumor that she travels in person to intimidate a young woman into a promise. She has completely failed to account for Elizabeth's strength of character, the same internal reference and stubbornness that had already refused to bend before Darcy's own wealth and status. When Lady Catherine reports back to her nephew on Elizabeth's intolerable impertinence, she hands him the hope he had not dared to have. She suffered a crushing defeat on her own ground. In attempting to assert her authority, she dismantled the last barrier standing between the two people she was trying to separate. The turning point of the story is the letter. From a psychological perspective, this is a compelling example of how changing the channel of communication can help break through cognitive bias. When Darcy wrote it the morning after the proposal, he was in a raw, agitated state. But the written format gave him something that face-to-face conversation had not: the ability to set out the facts without the defensive, superior tone that Elizabeth had found so grating. It was an act of radical honesty. Sharing a painful family secret with someone who had just rejected you is not something most people would do. What happens next is even more interesting. Darcy does not retreat into wounded pride. He acts. His particular combination of temperament demands the restoration of justice and the repair of a system in which a fault has been exposed. He acknowledges that Elizabeth's charge of ungentlemanlike conduct was deserved. As he will tell her later, she gave him a lesson he needed. She knocked the arrogance out of him. When the disaster with Lydia unfolds, Darcy takes responsibility. This is not a performance for Elizabeth's benefit. He genuinely believes part of the fault lies with him, because he failed to expose Wickham to society when he had the chance. His nature does not allow him to stand by. He locates the fugitives, negotiates with a man who is essentially blackmailing him, and takes on the full financial burden. His remarkable courtesy when they meet again at Pemberley, which so astonishes Elizabeth, is not a mask, and it is not a performance. It is his real face, previously hidden behind the armor of his prejudices. Darcy demonstrates what his Aunt Lady Catherine never could: the strength of character to acknowledge his own mistakes, and to direct all of that famous stubbornness toward becoming someone he can actually respect. The story of Mr. Darcy is not a simple tale about a wealthy man becoming kinder. It is a deep study of what happens to a strong intellect in conditions of total social isolation. Darcy spent years inside an information bubble in which his emotional distance and social awkwardness went entirely unchallenged. The result was a powerful cognitive distortion. Meriton society elevated his reserve into absolute arrogance, while Darcy himself, consumed by his own pride and internal ethical conflict, simply stopped accounting for other people's inner lives. He was not blind. He could see clearly that Elizabeth and Jane stood apart from the rest of their family. But his fixation on the problem of the match prevented him from seeing Elizabeth as a human being, rather than as the object of his own agonizing dilemma. There is a dangerous bias at work here. Darcy was so occupied with his own heroic, internal struggle that he fell into the illusion that his condescension automatically entitled him to gratitude. And here, by contrast, appears the figure of Wickham, the perfect example of how our perception walks straight into the trap of surface charm. Wickham constructs a flawless first impression behind which there is nothing. Darcy makes a disastrous first impression while possessing genuine integrity. This is the central lesson of Part 1. Our brains are predisposed to trust the attractive surface and to penalize those who don't fit our expectations of pleasant company. Darcy found the strength to admit that his private conviction of being right gave him no license for public arrogance. But if he was fighting his pride, Elizabeth Bennet fell victim to an even more insidious distortion: confirmation bias. How her sharp mind became the very thing that blinded her, and why her father's passive indifference nearly ruined the lives of all 5 of his daughters. That is the subject of Part 2. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the breakdown of Elizabeth Bennet's psychological games. It only gets more interesting from here.